Lead us from the unreal to the real. Lead us from darkness unto light. Lead us from death to immortality. Om, peace, peace, peace. Good morning and welcome everybody. We have a special guest today, this morning. For a long time, we had been thinking of inviting an expert in Tibetan Buddhism to talk to our congregation here. Often in the Q&A sessions, we come across, I have faced so many questions about Vedanta and Buddhism. Philosophical questions, practical questions. I think, is Subrata Babu here today? No. He is the one with the largest number of questions, yes, about Tibetan Buddhism. And I was on the lookout. The thing is, we wanted somebody who is part professor, part practitioner, so somebody who has to be a serious practitioner and a teacher. And of course, the Tibetan lamas themselves are very genuine and very learned, and they are genuine practitioners. The only thing is that we also wanted somebody who could communicate easily in English. So that narrowed it down quite a bit. And one day, I was giving a talk somewhere downtown, and a lady who turned out to be a student of Scots, she said, when I was talking about this, she said, I know just the person. And then she recommended Scott, and we got in touch, and it worked out. So let me tell you a little bit about Scott. He's a Buddhist teacher in Brooklyn here, so he is easily accessible here, and I would encourage you to look him up on the net and actually try out his meditation sessions. Today's talk is, of course, more of a lecture on Tibetan Buddhism, but he has promised to do a short meditation session at the end. And then he'll take questions too. He was ordained by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and he spent 9 years as a Buddhist monk in Nepal and in India and in United States, studied and meditated. He teaches meditation and Buddhist psychology in groups and one-to-one settings. He is trained in Buddhist philosophy and meditation. He has got training from some of the greatest living masters in the tradition, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, Sokni Rinpoche, and Tulku Sangang Rinpoche. He regularly gives talks at Tibet House, Nalanda Institute, at Insight LA. He gives retreats with Sokni Rinpoche's Pundarika Sangha, and in many, many other places. He is also well known for integrating his meditation teachings with modern life here in Manhattan. So without further ado, I invite Scott. Give him a big and warm welcome. Scott, please come.
What I thought we'd do is start with a little bit of practice. We can end with some practice too, but I'd like to start with just a chant of the Buddha. And so this is the Shakyamuni Buddha's name mantra, Tayata Om Muni Muni Mahamuneye Soha. And so I thought we could chant that a little bit with a practice which I'll introduce. And so here, you can feel free to close your eyes. Just find a posture that's a little bit upright. And feel free to close your eyes, and we're going to begin to imagine the Buddha's form in front of us. So if you'd like, you can imagine within a lotus flower or a sun and moon disk, or if you'd like, on a throne of elephants as well. Whatever feels comfortable for you. And however the Buddha arises within your mind in the form of a monk. And here, imagining him as lifelike as possible, not just as a painting, but as if he's right in front of us, shining with the light of wisdom. And we'll just spend a few moments focusing our mind on that image. whether the image is bright and alive or it's just a memory and the image is not so clear, we just connect with that and place our attention and awareness. And with that, we're going to chant the Buddha's name in the form of this Sanskrit mantra. So please join me when you feel comfortable. Thaya ta om muni muni maha munaye soha. 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 So with this, we're going to imagine the Buddha just coming to the crown of our heads. And here you can leave him, or if you'd like, you can imagine the Buddha representing enlightened compassion and wisdom begins to dissolve into you, merging with also your forms of God, your forms of how you connect to awakening in your mind, in your prayers. And as he merges with your body and mind, just completely rest within that space for a moment. We call it in Tibetan sungjuk, which means to indivisibly rest with the nature of reality and the nature of our minds. So we become one with the Buddha's enlightened wisdom, enlightened mind, enlightened compassion. Just feeling that throughout your experience right now, just resting with that. Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay if I sit back a little bit? I have a very loud voice. It's okay? Okay. So, as I said, it's really an honor to be here with you all today. And I think I was requested to talk about Tibetan Buddhist philosophy and practice. And as many of you know, this starts in India, right? This starts with the Buddha, with his life and awakening, and the spread of that across the Indian subcontinent, all the way into China, Sri Lanka, Thailand, and eventually Tibet. Yeah, Tibet being one of the more later places Buddhism started to enter, but we could say it was also entering and probably exiting for a lot of years. as Buddhism started to enter Tibet, it was a very, excuse me, it was a very wild place, apparently. I wasn't there, but I've heard. It was more ruled by shamanic traditions. It was more ruled by, there was heavy influence of black magic and these kinds of things in certain areas, as well as, I'm sure, beneficial and healthy spiritual traditions. And so the story goes that the great Mahasiddha, Padma Sambhav, who probably was most likely from present-day Afghanistan and Pakistan, he was called as first the king of Tibet, King Trizon Ditsen, was trying to build the first monastery in Tibet. Generally in Buddhist philosophy and Buddhist religion, we feel that really Buddhism can enter a country, it can be taught there, it can be practiced, but it doesn't really thrive or fully exist there, or it's rooted there until the monastic tradition is rooted there. And so we usually say there needs to be at least 4 fully ordained monastics, and when there's a root of that, when there's a support for them and their practice, their study, and they're also supporting the community, then the Buddha Dharma is rooted in a place fully and can exist there for a long time. So the king, the Tibetan king, wished for this to happen in Tibet. And so first he invited actually Shantarakshita from, besides Nalanda, Vikramashila. Yeah. So there's a few major monastic colleges and institutes in India, right? We have Nalanda, I think Vikramalashila. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So he was from this place. And so he was invited by the king, and he came, and he was a very great scholar and yogi. And when he arrived, they started to build, and they would build this massive, monastery. And then the story goes that at the nighttime, Tibet was full of malicious spirits, right? Ones who didn't want the Dharma to be there because they knew it meant their end, right? They couldn't continue with their shenanigans. So Shantarakshita, so they would build in the day, and then at the night, these malicious spirits would tear down the monastery, apparently. And so after a while, the king went to Shantarakshita and said, "What's going on here? I don't understand." And he said, "Oh yeah, so we need to invite Padma Sambhav." So Padma Sambhav, for those of you who don't know, like I said, he was born in probably Afghanistan, around that area, and he was born actually, as the myth goes, he was born into what looks like a human body, but he was born from a lotus. So he wasn't actually born of a mother and father. So he was born already an enlightened being, but of course, through his life, he went and studied and practiced and became a greatly realized siddha. And by the time he was invited to Tibet, he was fully ripened as a practitioner, fully able to benefit. And so the story goes that Padma Sambhava tamed some of these malicious spirits. And tamed is a very interesting concept in Buddhism. I think we could talk a little bit about this, because maybe it'll help us to start to enter the philosophy a little bit. Yeah. So tamed here doesn't mean taking a sword and threatening them. Tamed doesn't mean yelling at them or scolding them. It means taming their heart. The heart that's angry, the heart that's malicious, the heart that's destructive, right? So when we say tamed, he was able to convince them somehow that the Dharma is something they need and they want, and it's something beneficial for them. And so in the Tibetan Buddhist pantheon of protectors and deities and these kinds of things, these first malicious spirits that were destroying, essentially preventing the Dharma from rooting in Tibet, were transformed into protectors of the Dharma. Yeah, and this is a Vajrayana viewpoint, which I'm going to get into in a moment. Yeah, obviously stemming from the Tantric milieu of India. So the story goes, so Padma Sambhava came, was able to tame these malicious forces, and then the monastery was built, and slowly the first monks were ordained, and Buddhism began to disseminate in Tibet. And we call this the Nyingma tradition, yeah, which is the early school of Tibetan Buddhism. What this means is the translations from it wasn't so much the Pali canon, though I'm sure some of that was happening. It was mostly the Buddhist canon that still existed in Sanskrit and the Mahayana canon. And so this was being translated, as well as Tantric Buddhism or Vajrayana Buddhism was being spread. So Padma Sambhava was really a tantric master, a master who used swift means of working with the energy body, means of working with visualization, these practices, in order to bring about awakening. And so he also began to spread those teachings throughout Tibet. Yeah. So from there, that tradition thrived, and then it also had times of other kings who weren't so virtuous, and so there's problems. And I'm not going to go so much into the history, but eventually we had what's called the new translation schools come into Tibet. So that's what really formed these main 4 or 5 traditions within Tibetan Buddhism. Some of you may have heard, where we have the Nyingma tradition, this early translation, right, which is coming through Shantarakshita, Padma Sambhava, also other Indian Mahasiddhas, Vimalakirti, and many, many others who helped, yeah. Then we have this, what's called the later translation, or the new translation school, which is really, we could say, started with, it's popularized through a monk named Atisha. And so Atisha was invited because things had degenerated a little bit by this time. We're talking, a few thousand years later. Things had degenerated, and he was invited to bring or resurge or bring back energy or life into the Dharma there. So Atisha, when he got to Tibet, he described a few problems. So he asked one of his students, he asked, so how do you practice? How do Tibetans practice Buddhism? And he said, so in the morning I do the practices associated with the Theravada vehicle, or the Shravakyana vehicle, which is the first turning of the wheel of the Buddha, right on the Four Noble Truths. Then in the afternoon, I do Mahayana practices relating to the second turning of the wheel of the Dharma from the Buddha. And then in the evening, I do Tantric or Vajrayana practices, right, with working with deities like Tara or whatever, Chenrezig, these different manifestations of enlightened mind, as visualizations, as mantras, etc. And Atisha said, oh, okay, I know the problem now. I know what's going on. You don't know how to merge all these into one. You don't know how to use this as a unified practice. You're separating the Dharma, right? So then from this, Atisha sort of reformed a little bit what was going on, and other traditions could spread. Up to this point, there was also other traditions forming, such as the Sakya tradition and the Kagyu tradition. So these are 2 other lineages. And then we have the Gelugpa tradition, which is the most recent one, really forming around a great Tibetan Mahasiddha named Je Rinpoche, or Lama Tsongkhapa. And so this is kind of the history of some of the lineages. This is why, there are different lineages. I would say Tibetan lineages also, they form around also the way, what siddhas they're connected to in India, right? So for instance, the Kagyu tradition really developed out of a lineage disseminating from Tilopa and Naropa, where we can go now to Nepal and India and see some of their holy sites. So in Pashupatinath in Nepal, you can go, there's some caves of them there. And so these, and most likely, I'm not a historian, so I can't say so much, but most likely Tilopa and these siddhas, I'm a big fan of trying to understand really what was going on in India at that time. And I'm not a historian, so I don't know exactly, but in Western thought and theory, we like to separate things out. But when we really look, someone like Tilopa, it wasn't like the Buddhists are here and all the Vedic traditions are here. Everybody's interacting with each other. And I think this more modern way of viewing it, this kind of way that's also not a colonial way of viewing it, I find personally helpful to understand someone like Tilopa. If someone would come to him with wanting Buddha Dharma, he would teach in maybe Nagarjuna's perspective or something like that. And someone coming to him wanting Vedanta perspective or something else, he would give them that, right? This is quite beautiful, I find. So anyways, Then one of Naropa's students was what we call him the translator Marpa. So this was a Tibetan man who made many journeys over the Himalayas to study. So really in the Tibetan tradition, we owe it to some of these pioneers who really endured incredible hardship, weeks of walking through, I couldn't even imagine. I mean, I've tried to hike through Colorado's mountains, and I couldn't even imagine the Himalayas, trying to manage that. So anyways, many times he went over, and he was also a trader, and he met Naropa and received the tantric lineages through him. So really these different lineages in Tibetan Buddhism, whether it's Gelug, Nyingma, Kagyu, Sakya, and then we have a fifth called the Jonang school. These are not delineated so much in their differences philosophically, though there are some subtle differences and some different approaches, but really it's the tantric lineages or the Vajrayana lineages that they're coming through, right? So when I'm talking about Tibetan Buddhist philosophy and practice, really we have to talk about Indian philosophy and practice, because this is the roots of everything, right? In Tibetan Buddhism, and you'll hear the Dalai Lama say often, really it's he would say generally, no matter what the lineage is, we uphold the Nalanda tradition. You know, we connect through that. That's what those are our gurus of who we learn from, right? So these are great practitioners, great scholar yogis like Nagarjuna, like Shantideva, etc., right? And so, has anybody been to the complex in Nalanda? Yeah. Yeah, if you haven't, please go. It's really quite amazing, because it really, again, I'm still learning about Indian culture and history and the contributions of the Indian subcontinent and its people, but it really struck me when I went there, because our guide said, the ruins you're seeing are not, nothing. It's like, he said it went for miles, you know? So you could just imagine how many, not only monastics were thriving there, but how that was interacting with the community. So it was really the world's first university, probably, yeah, and one that was incredibly. I can't even imagine how much that affected how much that benefited the people of India. So, anyways. So we could see in a place like that, with that amount of concentrated effort, energy, the kind of practitioners that would come out of there, right? And so Tibetan Buddhism, essentially, when we're talking about Sutrayana philosophy, then, you know, talking about the nature of reality, we have this term shunyata, right, in Buddhism that we're exploring, and we have, I would say the Buddhist tradition is very interesting, because there's not a monolithic idea of what that is, which I like, you know, again, because we can see there's one perspective from one sage, one great philosopher or yogi, such as Nagarjuna, and generally the Tibetan Buddhist tradition follows his principles and ideas, but then there's some disagreements with subtle points, right? Ultimately, we're talking about how we interact with our relative reality, what we see, what appears to us, and then what it actually is, right? So the fundamental problem from a Buddhist perspective, if I just want to be very succinct and clear, when it comes down to the philosophy, is those are usually out of sync, right? They're out of line. So how things appear to us is not how they actually are, but we believe them to be that way. So in Buddhism, we describe this like an illusion, like a dream, etc., right? And so no matter what tradition or lineage one is practicing within Tibetan Buddhism, the fundamental principles of the Four Noble Truths, the fundamental principle that what binds us is really this thing that's out of sync, that reality itself is moving. It's like water, is an expression in Tibetan Buddhism, but we often are relating to it like ice. So we get stuck in our emotions, we get stuck in our thoughts, we get stuck in our identifications around who we are, who we think we are, who we think other people are, right? And so the idea of the path is to be able to fully have discernment, but to be able to wake up out of that illusion and dream, right? And I don't think this is unlike, exactly, yeah. Yeah. So with that as the fundamental base, then there's lots of different styles and means to bring that about, right? So the Tibetan Buddhist tradition really takes advantage of that. So some of you may know already, so based on the Four Noble Truths, the truth of dukkha or suffering, that the truth that there's a cause, karma and afflictive emotions for suffering, the truth that there can be a cessation, right, the third noble truth, and the truth of the path. And no matter what the tradition is in Buddhism, whether it's Tibetan Buddhism or Theravada or whatever, the principles of the path always apply, but the means of that path might change. And that's what I want to talk about. It's specific to Tibetan Buddhism a little bit more. So the principles are our behavior, our ethics, how we use our body, speech, and mind, right? I don't really like to use the term morality because it can be misunderstood and seem dogmatic, but actually it just comes down to how is our behavior affecting our life? How is it affecting our relationship with others? How is it affecting our mind? Are we becoming more peaceful from our behavior or less peaceful, right? So I know personally when my mind's angry, I'm not very peaceful. It's much harder to meditate too, right? So just basic principles around that. And usually the Buddhist tradition is formed around avoiding 10 non-virtues, right? We call it. So then based on that, one can develop meditative awareness or meditative concentration, right? Which is a settling of the mind. I like to say it's like taking a glass of muddy water, and then if we just put it down and leave it alone long enough, the mud will begin to settle, right? So, and we begin to experience a clarity of awareness, a calm in the body, and then as that grows and manifests, that awareness grows further and further until we have a very stable mind, very stable concentration as well as a clarity of mind. Then from there, there's still the problem though, right? Because I said the mud just settled. There's still the mud, right? So so it's still there. It's not stirred anymore for that kind of practitioner, right? But it's still there. So that's when shunyata comes into the picture. That's when we have to then take on the practices of investigating through many different means of what we call it latong in Tibetan, but it's special insight in English, basically. It means practices to cultivate and point out and pop our illusion, essentially, right? And so there's many, like I said, Nargajuna focused on two ways of doing this, delineating between what we call the two truths, right? So relative truth and ultimate truth, and delineating what is appearance that's real but not true, and then what is appearance that's in line with the nature of reality, right? So this is a very big topic. I don't have time to go into it. So anyways, that's one way of looking at it, right? We would say that's more of a Sutrana approach. Another way is the Tantric or Vajrayana approach. So the Tantric approach or Vajrayana approach in Buddhism, really you see this full display in Tibetan Buddhism, right? So that's why I thought I'd spend a few moments, because it's kind of what makes it a little bit distinct. Some early scholars, usually British kind of early Western scholars, were attributed that Vajrayana Buddhism was kind of not Buddhist, that the Buddha didn't teach it, and that it was sort of more or less like a Vedic influence on Buddhism. So nonetheless, I'm sure there is that Vedic influence. We also see in the people who study the Kashmiri Shaivite tradition, it's almost the same as the Buddhist Tantric tradition, very similar. Even Atisha, the great master I mentioned before, he said only like a very, very refined master, someone with a lot of realization, could distinguish the difference. He said it's very, very refined. And not to distinguish the difference to make an argument, just to know from one's practice, yeah, which path you're taking. But either way, there's another alternative from this Western view that I was saying, that, you know, it formed out of the Vedic tradition. And in the Buddhist tradition, we do believe the Buddha did teach Tantric Buddhism. Yeah, so there was a story where it originated in India, where there's actually a few stories of how it possibly came into the world. But this one is that there was a great king. Some say his name was King Za, but then there's another name I'm forgetting right now. But anyways, there was a great Indian king, and he basically came to the Buddha not only with a lot of anxiety, but really sad that he couldn't become a monk. He said, I want to become a monk. I want to practice. I want to devote fully to the Buddhist practice, but I can't do it. I have too many people who rely on me. This is a very beautiful person, actually, if you think about it. I have too many people who are counting on me to take care of them and to make sure the kingdom runs smoothly. And the Buddha said, no problem, because he could see his karma. He could see his potential as a human being and where he was at in this life, in that life. And so they say the Buddha manifested as a tantric deity, Guhya Samaja, and initiated this king into this practice, right? Now, the history gets a little murky from here, which is you don't see a lot of mention of Buddhist tantric practice. It really starts to emerge much later. So some theories are that it did come out of a merging of Vedic tantra and Buddhist. But from a Buddhist perspective, it's just that these teachings are, one way we translate the term gyu in Tibetan is like a secret mantra, or it can also mean continuity. It can mean different things. But this term secret mantra applies here. And not secret in the sense like it's trying to protect something, or not that it's trying to hide something from someone. Secret in the sense is very hard to see. It's very difficult to see, right? Because we're talking about shunyata in its most subtle form, which is the very nature of our experience, right, as a human being. The Buddha talked about this in the framework of some Mahayana sutras that are later. We call them the third turning in the Tathagatagarbha Sutra, which is on Buddha nature, right? This fact that all sentient beings, no matter how evil they might seem, or how good they might seem, underneath is this Buddha nature, this potential for awakening. It's a very beautiful teaching. And so the Tantric path also uses that expression and that understanding of the nature of mind, the nature of beings, the nature of reality to bring about practice. But anyways, back to the history here. So most likely, because this was a secret tradition, it wasn't given on a mass level. And actually the power of Buddhist Tantra comes down to the one-to-one transmission from guru to student. One Tibetan Lama named Songsar Khyentse Rinpoche, really, I encourage you to try to meet him and study with him. He's a lover of India. He also feels Tibet kind of, he's a little bit critical of what happened with Vajrayana Buddhism in Tibet because it became a mass scale. You know, it started disseminating on a mass scale, which I think worked in Tibet. It became sort of blended with the culture very skillfully. So Tibetan Buddhism, when you look at it, it's a fully Vajrayana culture. It's a tantric culture. All of the imagery, when you walk into a temple, you see, the tantric deities, full display, and nobody has an issue with that because it's just ingrained with the culture. In one way, this is very skillful because people can gain a connection with it right away when they're born into that culture. They can meet and then begin to understand and connect with those practices. But in another way, there's a danger it can lose this essence or transmission, right, of one-to-one. I think in Tibet it wasn't so much of an issue because you had many realized practitioners. You still do. But either way, probably most likely it was hidden for a long time within India because it was just very small, from one-to-one and very small groups of people. And then it started to get more and more. But there was the karma for this to become the main transmission within Tibet and the main sort of way the Dharma is held. But what I was saying earlier about this story about Atisha, when he came to Tibet and said, oh, you're separating, it really comes down to the fundamentals of what Tibetan Buddhist practice is, which is a unification of Sutra and Tantra, a unification of Shravakyana, which comes from the Pali Canon and the Four Noble Truths, Mahayana, which comes from more these, we call them later sutras, but actually now historians are discovering they were coming out right around the same time. So there's some new information that's very interesting I have to read up on. Mahayana, and then the Tantras, these more direct methods for bringing about inner transformation and basically connecting to our Buddha nature, connecting to the nature of reality. So Tibetan Buddhism is very unique and that it finds ways to not abandon any of these practices. So, for instance, one can be a monastic practitioner and practice the tantric path, right? One can do it as visualization, as mantra, yeah? Also, one can be a householder practitioner with a husband or wife and a family and practice what's in line with the Shravakyana vehicle, Mahayana and Tantric vehicle, yeah? And so the purpose is to see that these are they're not fighting, they're not in conflict with each other at all, right? Because the main point is we see, what are we trying to bring about? Now I'll kind of end on this note, I think. What are we trying to bring about with Buddhist practice? We're trying to bring about awakening. We're trying to bring about this quality, this potential for Buddhahood, for this quality we call Buddha nature or Tathagata Garbha. We're trying to recognize that and fully develop that, yeah, until we're fully enlightened, awakened, and free from the bondage of karma, free from the bondage of samsara and the cycle of suffering, yeah? So no matter what the means are for that, the point is to do that. So the Tantric means what becomes very specialized within Tibetan Buddhism. We could say one thing about Tibetan Buddhism also that's very special, which is the Tantric teachings really, they disappeared everywhere else. The only, as the Buddhist Tantric teachings, the only places they exist still are in Tibet and now where Tibetan Buddhism has disseminated its teachings, and in a Japanese tradition. There's one Japanese tradition who still has some Buddhist Tantra. But other than that, it was completely lost in India as far as the Buddhist Tantric tradition, and lost in other places. So that's one thing that's very special. And I can't go, there's not time to go too much into, into the differences or exactly what Buddhist Tantric practice is. But I will say we're engaging with our full human experience. One way we sum up the paths of the Buddha and also how they're in union is with the Shravakyana vehicle, this vehicle of coming mainly out of the Four Noble Truths and the Pali Canon. We're mainly applying the skillful means of putting up a boundary, is what I usually say, or putting up a fence. So if something's agitating us, we say, okay, I need a break, right? So for me, if New York starts to overwhelm me, okay, I'm gonna go upstate or go take a break if I can, or go to the park or whatever, right? So this is a Shravakyana means, and it's actually very skillful. Because sometimes we need to do that. If we're having an argument with someone, maybe it's better to take a break from them for an hour or something, yeah? Then Mahayana emphasizes really transformation, and transformation through selflessness. So not just putting up a boundary, but what we start to recognize is that others are just as important as we are. Our wishes do not take precedence over someone else's. And so we start to make important not just our own wishes, values, and what we want to bring about, but those of others. And so what starts to happen is a transformation of clinging, a transformation of what we call self-clinging. Then the Tantric tradition is very unique, the Buddhist Tantric tradition, in that it doesn't necessarily avoid or put a boundary. It doesn't necessarily transform in that same way I was talking about, though we use those two. As I said, we integrate all of it in Tibetan Buddhism. But it mainly relies on bringing into the path what we're working with, what's appearing in front of us. So that very thing, that very emotion, that very thought, that very experience becomes the path, which is much more difficult. Because how does anger become the path of Dharma, right? So you could see why it's a little bit secret. And secret not in the sense like there's something to hide, but secret because it's challenging. It's not easy to access that, right? I think, though, and one Tibetan Buddhist teacher said this recently, and I agree with him. It's a very powerful path for us these days. For modern people, he said he feels it's custom made. Like the Buddhas kind of custom made this, and now is the time for this. Why? Because in modern life we have no choice. We have to interact with money. We have to interact with the world. We have to interact with a very busy life, right? And so here we have a chance to recognize the Dharma, the path, the nature of experience, shunyata, right within what's happening to us in the moment. And of course, this takes preparing through the other two paths of Shravakya and Mahayana. But he was saying he feels it's custom made, and I think it's true. Because the main thing I'm trying to say here is the Buddhist Tantric path is you don't abandon, you recognize the nature, right? Because what's blocking our happiness is not is not recognizing the nature. So if we recognize the nature, what else do we need, right? So it's a little bit complicated the way I gave my talk today, but I think I hope you got something out of it. And really the point I wanted to make is no matter what the Buddha taught, these are really unified in this principle of understanding what's binding us, understanding what our predicament is, understanding what binds us to suffering, and how to liberate from that. And I think every religion is doing the same thing. And then, of course, Buddhism has its description about why we're bound, right? And the root of that is confusion. The root of that is not understanding nature. It's misperceiving what the experience is. Like I said, we have the experience that what appears to us is real as it is. But if we check a day later, it often changes, right? I mean, maybe yesterday you loved the rain. I don't know, some of you. And then tomorrow you'll hate the rain, right? So which rain? What is the quality of rain then? It's very interesting, right? So things like this we're exploring. And the Tantric path is really to face that directly. And of course, using images of, we have principles of deity yoga, where we embody the qualities of a certain deity to bring about enlightenment now. So we're not waiting for enlightenment in the future. We're trying to bring it out now. So anyways, maybe we could do some question and answer. Yeah.
All right, thank you very much.
Yeah.